What is up, everybody? Spring has not sprung. That means one thing. It's time to hit the whitetail woods. I've got Erik Barber across from me. We're talking shed hunting, but we're also talking 5 things, and I know I'm going to make it more than 5 things.
Absolutely.
You can learn from a shed antler. We're talking about sheds, finding them, but the why behind they're there, which can help lead you to your big buck in the fall.
Definitely.
I know one of these sheds on the table I scooped from Coop's desk.
Yeah.
I think we did a podcast a while back. He likes shed hunting. Like sometimes he'll go like, I think I like shed hunting more than actual deer hunting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just tell him that he's wrong.
He is wrong. Coop finds a lot of sheds though, so I could understand it. He finds a lot of big sheds
He finds
too.
a lot of big ones.
Yeah.
Yeah. Erik, what do we got? What do we got going on? We got a few in front of us right now. But what the heck can a person learn from a shed antler?
Man, I think there is
it doesn't talk.
It doesn't talk, but it tells you a lot with saying very little.
Ooh.
So
it doesn't talk, but it does.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So I mean, it's no secret. A lot of whitetail hunters specifically get after sheds. This time of year from like a scouting standpoint. Like you mentioned, Mark, the weather's finally starting to get a little bit better. Everyone's kind of trying to beat off that cabin fever and get out in the woods, put some miles on, and hopefully find some shed antlers along the way. I think what we're kind of hoping to get out of this today is like, what are the things that you can take away from that? Like, it's one thing to kind of walk haphazardly in the woods, find a couple sheds. Nothing wrong with that. I love doing that and do it frequently. But I think there's a couple questions that you can ask yourself when you are out there, when you do find a shed, to take away a little bit of actionable intel that can hopefully put whatever the antler is that you're holding in front of your tree stand the next fall.
Yeah, like when they're stuck together.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I like that.
Much better when there's a skull plate in between. Yeah. But I think just kind of diving into it, I think the main thing obviously is proof of life. It sounds super basic, but I mean, how many times has somebody seen a big buck, had photos of a big buck, or just any deer for that matter, that, they spend time hunting or chasing the next year without any intel to suggest that deer is actually alive. That can be the difference of somebody wasting a season, chasing a ghost, or actually, knowing that, hey, this thing did make it through and here's what I know from it. So when you find a shed, obviously you know that deer made it through, survived the hunting seasons. It's not necessarily through out of the thick of it, because it's still there's a lot of, gnarly winter weather that can pop up from, January through March. Mm-hmm. So just because you find an antler it's not a blanket statement that yes, this deer is going to be around next year to chase. But it's a very good indicator that it survived the gauntlet of hunting seasons.
It survived the gauntlet of hunting season, probably the toughest part of
Yes.
the winter. So if it made it through that, but like you say, though, case in point, I was out shed hunting. This was 2 years ago. I texted you some pictures of it.
Yep.
And I found a dead buck. He was a shed buck. It was probably about this time of year, what we're in, the beginning of March or something like that. Maybe it was even a little bit later. Very new, like coyotes hadn't got to him, and I tried to investigate to the best of my ability. I'm like, what the heck killed this thing? I still don't know to this day. There was a road that wasn't, he was probably, I don't know, 600-700 yards from a road. Did he get hit by a car and go back in there and die? I don't know, but had you picked up his horn somewhere, you'd be thinking, oh, this guy's good to go.
Exactly.
So take it with a grain of salt, but it is a very...
Yeah.
I'd say the likelihood that deer is alive is probably in its favor.
It's a very good indicator that, you hopefully have something to chase next year. I did kind of building off that. I mean, who knows what the demise of that deer was. It could have been a car, could have been, any number of things. When I worked at DNR, the biologist always just described winter as a long period of starvation. Which is just the most grueling thing to imagine. You think about deer out there when we're tucked away at home and, sub-zero temperatures, nasty wind chill, snow coming down sideways. That deer's laying out under a cedar tree somewhere trying to, just survive.
Oh, dude, I always think about how darn tough those things are. When I'm out there hunting them and I'm like, oh, I've been out here for 3 hours and I'm like, I can't feel my hands or my feet. I'm like, dude, these things just live. Anyway.
Exactly. So, okay, proof of life is number one. The next thing, now is where you start getting into a little bit more of the nuance and what I think is some of the more exciting, almost like investigative aspect of shed hunting. So based on how you find the antler, where it is, how it lays there, is there a match? Is the match right next to it? You can kind of put your CSI hat on and start to figure out some tendencies of like what that deer was doing when you found it, when it shed its antlers. So the example that I always go back to is probably 2016, a match set, the biggest set that I ever found. I should have brought it in today, but absolute giant buck that I found on a piece of public when I lived in Iowa. And these things were laying right next to each other. They were literally in a bed with a cedar tree on on the uphill side of the bed, to imply that the deer had that tree up at its back looking downhill.
Classic.
Yeah, it was on a southern exposure on a big CRP knob, implying that there's a lot of sunlight hitting it. And, if I just had to imagine that deer was tucked up in there on like a northerly wind on the leeward side of a ridge, stood up, shook a little bit, dumped both his antlers literally right next to each other, and that was like a pinpoint on a map. Like, yes, I know this exact buck was bedded in this exact spot. So, to kind of expound on that a little bit more, it's like, what would you give for that intel? Like people would do just about anything to know, like, oh, this buck was exactly right here. That is a great starting point for the following year.
I mean, you've basically, it's the equivalent of like seeing that buck in its bed.
Yep. Exactly.
Or jumping that buck up without jumping it up.
Right. It's like sight fishing bass on beds. When bass are spawning and you're fishing them on beds, it's the same thing. But not to derail too much. So that's one example. If you find sheds that are let's say you do find the match, or it is just one, and it's in that kind of classic bedding condition, or that bedding type habitat, you can likely imagine that deer was bedded in that area. On the flip side of that, I've also found match sets in the past where you're walking trails, like bed to feed trails. And I can think back to another, decent little match set that I found a couple of years ago, where I was walking a very, very worn trail in between, food source and a bedding area, definitely like classic transition area. And I picked up a right side of like a nice young, 5-point side, half of a 10-pointer, and, continued walking that trail, and maybe 150 yards further down the trail, boom, there's the other side. So obviously, that deer was walking down that trail. You even have an idea of like its line of direction
of travel. That's what I was going to say. When you found those, the right,
on the right
these
side
things
of the
have
trail.
a right and a left.
Yep.
So one was on, one side of the trail, when I assume the other was at least edging towards the other side.
Exactly. So that's another example. And then, the list could go on and on. I've found these things hanging in cedar trees in the past, where it's like, that's cool. The deer was probably, transitioning through that area, got a little frisky, started rubbing a cedar tree or something, got a shed kind of tangled up in that, and it popped off. But I would say like the other example is you just find one in a feeding area. And it's easy to point your fingers at that and be like, oh, well, that's the least valuable, because you don't know exactly where that deer. Anybody can assume that, okay, food sources are going to hold shed antlers. It's like, yeah, that's not rocket science. But it is still an indicator that, hey, at this time of the year, this buck was feeding in this area, whether that's a clear cut, picked bean field, cornfield, whatever it is. It kind of gives you an idea of what that deer's food sources were that it had available during the late season, especially if you're somebody, that doesn't have access to control or manipulate food. If you do have food plots and you find, a handful of sheds in your plots, that's great news. The deer are using your plots just as you intended. But, I would always there's two sides to that coin. If you're someone that's hunting public and you find one in a cedar thicket, or not a cedar thicket, but like a timber cut, or something like that, you can kind of ballpark that, hey, this buck was feeding in this area at this time of the year.
Well, and you've got that time of year, and whenever I find a shed, like I try to walk it back, right? And like we'll start walking back with the food source, like maybe you find a trend that you're like, oh yeah, like, there's heck, sometimes there's actually, corn on public land, depending
Sure.
on what
Yep.
programs they might have in place, or if you're on private land and have access to egg. But are you finding, for whatever reason, that I'm finding all the horns, they're in cut corn, they're not in the beans, or they're in the beans and they're not in the cut corn. So you can be like, okay, well, when I get to hunt in December, maybe I need to key in on one or the other. And this is, again, I'm assuming I don't have, I guess, the luxury of having that all the time. But and you're talking about finding a bed. It's like, well, yeah, you don't know, just have that bed, but you can stand up and look around and go, okay, he was bedded here. The wind was likely doing this. The access points are over here. He's bedded here because the access is over here, and he's going to see stuff coming. How can I get around? I mean, you can really do a lot of strategizing. Oftentimes, or I guess I haven't found a ton of sheds and beds, but I have found sheds and beds, and I swear every time I go, this thing's freaking bulletproof, man.
Absolutely.
Like, I know exactly why that thing is here.
Absolutely.
And then I rack my brain trying to figure out how to, do something about it.
Yeah.
But
And what you just alluded to there, like the strategizing, the questions, all that stuff, like that is probably like the third big thing that I would say somebody can take away from finding a shed. It's like you have time during the off season to ask yourself those questions. On the flip side, you find a big rub and a big fresh scrape on October 17th. You don't have a ton of time to sit there and strategize that specific area, because guess what? There's probably 17 more of those scattered throughout the woods. Mm-hmm. And like that buck might come back to that, but he also might hit any one of the others that are kind of scattered around there. Mm-hmm. So what shed season gives somebody is the luxury of time on their side. So you find a shed, you kind of have the rest of the season to spend really like dissecting that area, and kind of ground truthing different spots, especially if it's stuff that you might be unfamiliar with, or even if it is, a lease or a farm that you own. Heck, a lot of guys kind of stay out of certain areas of their properties.
That's exactly what I was going to go into.
Now is the time to dig into that.
Mm-hmm. There's no consequences.
Yeah.
There's no consequences. I mean, you can find that you can just go into places that you might not otherwise. I'm probably guilty of being like a little too, gingerly with it. And I probably should be a little bit more aggressive, but like you can be as aggressive as you want and put those puzzle pieces together. It's just like, it can be so huge, and you might find a cool horn, and that's always cool.
Exactly. And then, another one I would say, like a number 4 thing is just winter range in general. Mm-hmm. Depending on where you're at, I've spent quite a bit of time hunting like the northern part of Wisconsin, and you'll get deer yarding up there. Mm-hmm. Whereas, down here in the southern part of the state, food is a lot more accessible. It's more dispersed throughout the landscape. I do think we actually get yarding to a degree. I'd
say I see it. Yeah.
I would put like loose air quotes on it, and by that I mean like you're driving, the same stretch of road. Let's say your route to and from work. Mm-hmm. Well, all of a sudden in January and February, these fields have 50, 60 deer in it. Right. Whereas during, other times of the year, you might see a handful, maybe 1, 2. Mm-hmm. So yarding up clusters of deer that transition to a specific area at a certain time of year. And in the late season, I think what that does is that kind of that helps somebody qualify the information that they are getting from that shed. If I go and I walk an area where deer are yarded up, it's not necessarily guaranteeing that, hey, this buck is going to be right here next fall. It's definitely an indicator that he's in the general area. But if you do find yourself in one of those classic like deer yarding situations, where let's say a cedar swamp in northern Wisconsin, and you find a handful of sheds, like, yeah, that is great intel, but take it a little bit with a grain of salt, because in those deer yards, those deer can be coming from miles and miles away. On one extreme example, we found a shed in 2015. This was when I lived in southern Iowa. From a buck that we knew super, super well. It was a buck that I actually missed in 2013 and found his shed 4.1 miles as the crow flies from where I missed that deer. And that was in a very big timber setting. Everyone thinks Iowa, they think open country, which is certainly true, but there are also very much areas that have, big woods type habitat. And that's what this was. And we found that shed literally 4 miles on the very opposite side of the piece of public that I missed that buck on.
I mean, that's astounding, because I'd say that's, generally from what I hear, like definitely on the outside of what you hear the range of a whitetail buck is,
Right. Right.
And then there's always stories of this one was, super far away for XYZ, but I mean, it's a long ways for a whitetail buck,
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I would say generally, you find something, you can probably expect it to be within that like 1.5 2 mile-ish vicinity of like what is, kind of home range is. But obviously in this case, and that I'm kind of using as an example here, like that buck who had a very, very wide home range. Like he was going all over the place. And it was a very recognizable deer too. It's not like we're like, maybe that's the same buck. Like it was the same buck. He had 10 points on his right side. There's not that many of that buck running around out there.
I wish there were.
Yeah.
Sometimes I wish there, but then they'd be less special. Going back to if you find a horn on a horn, I call them horns. I know they're antlers. Don't write in. You know what? Actually, write in. What do I care? But you can also look at the trail. Maybe the horn pops off and you can't really tell like maybe you find one horn and you're like, well, I don't know what direction he's going. You can also look at the trail and look at the predominant travel direction of tracks. If there is one, I mean, sometimes you look at a trail and you're like, could have been coming or going. But sometimes you can see one where you're like, man, most of the tracks are going a certain direction.
Yep.
And then you're like, okay, well, why was he here? Or, are we close to food? So maybe he dropped this at the end of the day. Yeah. So, okay, so this deer was here in the evening perhaps. Things like, again, it's just, and, probably, half the time you're wrong, but.
Well, and that actually dovetails into the last thing that I had, which is, this probably sounds very basic, but sign in general.
Yep.
During, March, April, I mean, those are kind of like, I would say March is your classic shed hunting month. The sign has been preserved by a blanket of snow for a couple months now. So, all those big rubs and scrapes that you found last year, or that would have been, available to find last year that you probably didn't because you were walking very specific routes to and from, your hunting area, have been preserved by the snow.
Oh, yeah.
So, basic statement, obviously sign is in the woods. But what I think is a little bit more interesting there is now, okay, you find a shed antler, you can, apply that location where you found the shed to the proximity of some of those big signpost rubs and community scrapes. It's no secret you're going to find rubs and scrapes all throughout the woods. There's different value rubs and scrapes. You're going to find those signpost rubs or those community scrapes. Those are the areas that you want to be kind of paying attention to, where it's, hey, I found this big set in this area. I know that there's a signpost rub on this ridge, 2 ridges over, and down in this bottom there's a big community scrape. Those are both places where I'm going to have a trail camera the following year.
Yep.
It's going to give you a little bit more timely intel on if that deer, 1, made it through, 2, when can you actually expect him to be kind of sucked back into that area when you can start hunting him. So, yes, there is sign all over the place, and it's one thing to go through the woods marking every single rub and scrape you found on your phone, but they're not created equal. Like, you want to be really paying attention to the signpost rubs, community scrapes, and then if you can put those in close proximity to a big shed antler that you found, you're really starting to get a little bit more of an actionable next step of something that you can do that might put that deer, in bow range or gun range the following season.
100%. And I think one thing I'm guilty of is I drop pins like it's going out of style, right? And luckily we have the different icons where you can drop a shed antler, drop a rub here. What I'm guilty of, though, is not providing the context. Because I always think I'm going to remember, and I don't remember. There's a rub here. But what rub was that? Yeah. And I think what you're going to with there, or one thing that I think is spotting trends, though. Yeah. Like all of a sudden you look at maybe a certain terrain feature, and over years, you're like, oh, I've got a horn here, a horn here, a horn here. And they're all in different spots, but they all look the same in some ways.
Exactly. And I think what you mentioned there, kind of using your map's ability to provide notes and context or images, upload a photo in there too. For example, when I go through my maps, I'll like tap on some of these pins, and I've tried to do a better job in the last couple of years of like actually putting in, like if I'm going to drop a pin, I'm going to actually like put notes on it.
Yeah.
Take that. I mean, it's an extra 30 seconds. Like, here's the date. Here's what I found. Here, here's the context, and then, snap a picture, include that in there. That adds a ton because, you look at your map and it's like, holy crap, it looks like it's got chicken pox. There's stuff all over the place.
Pin vomit, dude.
But when you actually give yourself that little bit of extra context, it helps you kind of start, okay, this is the best, conditions that I think to hunt this area, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And you can, drop that stuff in there. It's going to help you make a better hunting decision than the following season.
100%. And, just like finding a horn in a bedding area that you maybe wanted to stay out of, you get to find sign that, like, I find, like, some of the sign that I find this time of year, like, allows me to be more aggressive. Yeah. Like, I'm like, yeah, I know what's in there, and I know that, I'm going to make a move. Or, where, I don't know, like, it's just the information really is power.
The things that somebody learns at this time of the year isn't going to be necessarily like the magic bullet to, that following season, but it at least kind of helps you hone your area. And then, within that area that you've identified, now you can do your in-season stuff the following year, and the cycle just repeats itself. So that's the fun part about, shed hunting, is it kind of keeps that fire going all season long versus, hey, I'm going to give this a shot for these 3 weekends out of the fall, and then it's over with, wipe my hands, you're done. Shed hunting just gives you a little bit more reason to kind of stay in the woods, have fun looking for antlers, and learn a heck of a lot while doing it.
100%. Nope, I think, and you're getting fresh air.
Yeah.
And exercise, which actually, Erik, I've been doing something the last couple of years that I call sheddercise. So I like to spring bear hunt. So that's like, one of the early hunts, and it can be a very strenuous hunt. But sometimes, and I guess it can hamper your shed hunting because you're adding weight to your pack, but I'll throw 40 on my back, go hunt for sheds.
Yep.
And then I get that real pack training shedder size.
Yeah.
But then you also find a horn, or might find a horn, and you find that buck sign that, then you take your notes and off you go. You're a better hunter. Like it's a holistic approach to hunting.
It is. It's a good one too. I think there's a lot of merit there. If you want to, knock 2 birds out at once, that's a great way to do it.
But awesome. Did we miss anything? I'm gonna go to my notes.
Yeah,
you brought you're like Jim. You're
digital notes.
Yeah, you brought digital notes. I brought the analog paper ones.
Mark with waypoints. We got that.
The woods are never going to look more like hunting season than they are right now. And I do think, and another thing I'm guilty of is like, kids, family, which, hey, these things are important. I'm not going to discount.
I don't think Crystal's listening, Mark. I think we're okay.
No. But it's fleeting. You think you've got all the time in the world, and then all of a sudden the woods blow up and you're turkey hunting and you can't see a darn thing. It's like, if you want it, you got to go now.
Yeah, I would say you really got, a handful. In states where I know I keep kind of going back to Iowa, but that's where I have a lot of experience. They have what I would say is a lot longer shed season than we have in the upper Midwest. In Wisconsin, Minnesota, the UP. Heck, up in like northern Wisconsin, your shed season might actually not start until late April.
Right.
But, in some of these areas like the southern part of Wisconsin, or any of those areas like in your classic Midwest, you really do have a short window of like when that snow finally gets out of there to when the woods green up.
I'd say late. The widest window considering all the states, like late Feb through
early April.
Early April
at the latest, I would say, because you're also competing with squirrels and all that stuff too. So
and speaking of competition, if you're on private, you do have a little bit more of a luxury of finding those sheds over time because hey, people are out there, they're doing the same things we are. Yep. And scooping up horns, and they're scooping up your information.
Yeah, definitely. There's one thing that you can definitely, place a bet on, and that's that if you get, nice 40, 50 degree weather weekend in early March, Pete, you're going to have company if you're out on public. So that's just kind of part of it.
But no, I like it. I think that we got it. Maybe other people have other stuff that they're learning from their horns, Eric.
Hide your prize. What do you mean? What do you mean there? Let's dive
Well, I didn't
into
even.
that.
I wrote that down, and that's more
That's a
just
good one.
something that I do. But
Always
then
bring a backpack.
Always-
Not only for that big bag of salt, but when you do see that fellow public landowner, stuff this in your backpack.
So yes, hashtag agree, Eric. And I'd written that down.
Yeah.
And then I was like, well, that's just like a note for me to remember. Because when I see that other person walking around the woods, I want to see theirs.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
You called me out here. I was trying to be selfish, and then you ruined it.
We're better off because of it.
You know what? I can sleep at night.
Yeah. Yep.
I'd have felt guilty about that.
Yeah.
Good karma now.
Shed hunting and therapy all in one.
I like it. Awesome, everybody. Well, hopefully you learned something about sheds and what you can learn from sheds from this podcast. What are you learning? Did we miss anything? Let us know.
Yeah.
And
let us know what you find this year.
yeah, post them up.
Bye, guys.
Bye. Happy hunting and shed hunting. Happy shed hunting.